Alright, so this is the second project file in the animation that I made. I'm going to walk through it. I'm going to go kind of object by object and what's visible on the camera first. We'll go through like animation and basic setup of these objects. Then we'll go into materials and shading, and then we'll go into rendering in the compositor. Might be some back and forth. This isn't like scripted or anything, but I'll try to keep it as linear as possible so it doesn't get unnecessarily confusing. Okay, so let's start. We're just going to start talking about the camera. Set your active camera with like Control 0. Select it in the Control 0. And then hitting 0 will zoom in or make your view the camera view. That's kind of how you can know that this is your active camera. This is the camera that's going to render it out. It's also indicated by being like the green camera being highlighted here. That can be kind of like obscure. Took me a little while to like figure out what was completely going on. That's what's going on. Okay, so for animation purposes, let's walk through the camera settings I have. First of all, it's on a damped track, which is set to this empty right here. Looking at that empty. The empty's targeted to the bird's body. Could have easily just set the damp track to look at the bird's body, but I kind of like having this extra level of control. Doesn't need to be there, but it makes me feel better. Camera settings. The focal length set to 50, good neutral camera length. I have like a background in video and photography, kind of based on like what I consider to be like a neutral focal length. Everyone has opinions about that. Other things. Pass part out. That's for in here. If you want to just black everything out that's not in the camera view, can be useful. Especially when you're like working with a lot of stuff. For now, not super necessary. We'll leave it on rendered view for now because the next thing is the depth of field. You can either set your target like that with the eyedropper, or you can set it by distance, which I guess is like a more realistic way of working. But I feel like this doesn't really give you any more control or better control. It's harder to tell distances in units in general in 3D for me. So just having this target the object, that helps a lot. F-stop, you can see here there's like bokeh where the curve of the barbed wire is kind of like heading either in or out, away or towards the camera. Guess it's away. I could add more to that. With like clay stuff, it seems like people like want these objects to look really small. Probably the best way of pulling that off is pulling this f-stop in really, really close. And you can see we're getting fuzzier around the edges. I left it at 2. I think that's good enough for this. Don't be afraid to pull this in a lot. Having these like effects that people are kind of looking for, it's like having reverb on like a vocal in audio. It's sort of like something that people don't necessarily notice, but like appreciate when it's there. So if you're trying to make something that's like eye-catching with like these kinds of like sort of realistic materials that look really appealing, adding a lot of bokeh and a couple other effects that we'll go over in the compositor node go a long way. So I think this learning about controlling the depth of field in f-stop means paying attention to your lens size or focal length, and this down here, this can go a long way with making like nice looking renders. It's worth paying attention to. I avoided it for a really long time, just because it's another thing you have to keep track of, but it's worth it. Okay, I guess next, the only light in the scene that isn't from the HDRI is an area light, just pointed at no object constraint. It's just pointed behind the camera to give a rim light, which is just something that if you're making a nice looking conventional render, having a rim light in the background to give you like some glow around the edges goes a long way, especially if your materials have subsurface on them. It's just another little trick like that. Having a ground plane to bounce light up off of is another one. You can see we have that here. It's pretty far away, so it might not make a difference with the bird specifically, but as we get farther down, you'll notice. Just, it's these little things that took me a long time to kind of pick up on, because they're like so ubiquitous that people don't really bring them up all the time. But it's like really how you get these things to like look this really specific particular way. This information slips through the cracks all the time, but it's super basic. Putting the stuff in your scene makes things look a lot better, or a lot, I won't say better, I'll say like more appealing. It's what some people, either if they have an eye for it or not, it's just like kind of what they're expecting to see. So it's a good idea to know what those things are, then you can decide if you want them or not for whatever look you're going for. All right, I'm not going to go over the modeling of the barbed wire. I completely lifted that from another tutorial that I'll share the link to. And now we can go ahead and talk about the animation for these things. So first of all, the animation for the camera, you'll see it's maybe not even that noticeable. You can kind of see it like around here if you pay attention to where the grid is, that the Y, that green line going in the background. You can see it's like shifting subtly. That's another really cheap trick to making things look nice, is having like some sort of noise on the transforms of the camera to give it like kind of a shaky handheld like feeling. And that is done in the graph editor. You can see here you have whatever you have selected, and all the controls here. And as long as you have keyframes for this thing, you can add controllers or modifiers. So for the X location and the Z location, if you go into modifiers, add modifier, noise, you can see that I have like a noise controller here. In these settings, you have the scale really, really high, the strength really, really low, and that'll kind of give it this like really vague drifting in the X and Z. The Y would be pulling in and out. Don't really want that. That's a little too distracting. You can copy these and paste them in another place. So the Z location has the exact same settings, but the phase is different so that they're not just shifting the same way in either direction. Because the noise isn't random. An important thing to note is when you paste these things in, so if we like copy this and paste it in, you can see it's not active at first. And actually this isn't active either. So when I rendered this out, this wasn't going. I don't think it's that noticeable. I'm not doing it again, but that's just something to keep an eye on. When you post, it's going to be unactive by default, so you need to make sure you turn that on. What else? That's all the animation I did with the camera, really, for this part. The next, I guess, is the animation for the bird. Nothing's really going on. The wings go up and down. That's just like the skeleton. Which I showed in the last video. And the head moving up and down. That's, again, just the skeleton. These are animated. They're just moving in the X, and because they have that shrink wrap modifier, they're sticking to the surface of the eye and moving around the curvature. Super simple. Now the eyelids in the back are popping in and out, and that is because I have keyframed here and the object properties, whether they're visible in the viewport and the renderer. When I did this again in like a later version of the scene, I didn't keyframe out the viewport visibility just because it makes it harder to select. It's only selectable when it's like visible on these keyframes. Just makes the whole thing more complicated. Even though it's nice to like see in the viewport when it's being rendered or not or whatever, it's just better to not animate that property and just do the rendered one. I believe that is it for animation and camera and light settings for this animation, or this portion of the animation. The next thing I guess I'll go into is, I've already shown off all the materials and everything for the bird. If we go into the materials for the barbed wire, it's very much the same as the metallic principled BSDF here with the spikes, and that the only difference is just a simple color ramp from dark red to light red in the base color. This is the same kind of roughness setup that I always have. As you can see, it doesn't look like real barbed wire, but it's just kind of like another one of those like nice looking materials that kind of shows off you know what you're doing. That's good enough for this. In the world, you can see I put a mapping node and texture coordinates onto the HDRI. The reason I did that is so that if I turn off transparency, you can control kind of like what part of the HDRI you're looking at. I know it's a little hard to see because it's all blurred out, but I think you get the idea. It's not that difficult. Let's get into the render settings now. This is kind of where the meat of this portion of the animation is in. After going over it in this time, it'll kind of be repeat information going forward, so I won't get into it as much. First of all, we'll turn transparency off again because we're going to want the actual what's being rendered to just be the objects in the scene. We'll obviously need to get that background out somewhere else down the line, and I'll show you how to do that, but this is really what we're concerned with, so this is what we're going to render. Up here, these are your view layers. I always do one called everything that just has everything, you know, included in view layer. If you're missing this check mark, it'll be up here in filters. I always have this, selectable, hide in viewport, and disable in renders, something that I can easily turn off and on in the collection view. So everything that says everything on. My rendering settings are pretty conventional, pretty default, right out of the box. Could have this on and probably should. As you can see, it reduces the number of samples per pixel based on estimated noise level. We'll speed things up a little bit. Important to note, I have motion blur off. As you could probably see in the animation, there is a lot of motion blur in this, but I find it more helpful to control that in the compositor rather than having it be like rendered out that way, which I will go over when we get to the compositor. Everything else is pretty much out of the box. Output 1920 by 1080, 30 frames per second. This is how I set up my naming convention and folder structure for renders. Super and easy, basic, 16 color depth, 0% compression, just the highest settings you can do. Export them as PNGs. I guess if I wanted to be like a real big boy, I would do OpenEXR, but I'm just not interested in that level of fidelity or resolution, I should say. PNG is good enough for me. Let's talk about render passes now. So for this view layer, I have passes for combined, which is, you know, just the default, everything you see being rendered. Combined RGBA buffer. Z, gonna show my ass. I don't really know what this does exactly. It's useful or necessary to get the post-processing motion blur done in the compositor, so we have to render that out. Vector, this is like the speed and direction objects are moving in your animation. Super important for doing the motion blur post-processing later on, so we leave that on. Everything else we don't need for this. Light, environment. This is going to output the background, even though it's transparent. We're going to need this later on, just to get that background put in place once we've done post-processing everything else. That's it for the everything view layer. We can go, there's two more. There's the bird, which just has the bird on here. Bird, lights, camera, everything else deselected. We're putting out the combined, the Z, and the vector, and nothing else. We could do more, but it would take more time. That's all the ones we need for now. Fence. This has the barbed wire, the fence, the wall, the lights, the camera. Same output here. Nothing different. Alright, so the rendering's done. Here's what the compositor looks like. If you've never opened this before, you're going to need to select use nodes, and if your viewer isn't showing up, you're going to have to hit backdrop here. If you're used to the shader node editor at all, A lot of the node wranglery commands will make a lot of sense to you. Shift Control click toggles through the different passes. This is a node called render layers. Down here is where you select what render layer you're messing with. So now I have my 3 render layers set up here, the everything pass, the fence pass, and the bird pass. So, first, before I forget, if your rendering is taking a really long time in here, OpenCL, if you have a GPU, that's going to help out. Otherwise, all right, let's go. So these are the passes, the image, the alpha, the depth, the vector, the noisy image. That's, I guess, if you are using a noise reduction filter without the filter, it'll show up there. That's just a guess. I'm not messing with that at all. So vector blur node. This is how I get the motion blur without rendering out the actual motion blur. You can see there is a little bit of difference between these two. It's not showing up as much here, but you'll notice it if you watch the animation. With the slider, the blur doesn't go past 2, but you can type in any value. It'll go higher. Speed, min, and max. I always set the max really high. These are just settings to play around with, see what look you like the most. This is having that level of control in post-processing is the reason I do it this way. It's way easier to set this stuff up after the fact and mess around with values for me than it is to do it before the rendering phase. Your image, your combined pass goes into image, depth or Z goes into Z, vector goes into speed, and then you have your vector blur. Alpha over, this will make more sense when I do it here with the fence pass. This just puts the second image over the top at a factor of whatever you want to set it at. The next, I'm just getting the environment out of the everything layer. That's alpha overing, and that's all going into a lens distortion node, which is what we are using to get our like bulging and chromatic aberration here and here. And it's gonna get real funky in a second. There you go. So this stuff is like another one of those extra little spices you can put on renders to make them look like the way people want renders to look. If you overdo it, people who know what to call out will call it out, but a little, I think, makes a big difference. And you shouldn't be afraid to put it in there because it's kind of like, it's what people want renders to look like. And if you're trying to make something that looks super appealing, having some lens distortion and chromatic aberration in there is not a bad thing. And I'm not even going to say don't overdo it. Like, use a lot if you want to. And it doesn't matter if somebody who knows what the word chromatic aberration means is going to on it. Anyways, that's all going into the composite node. It's important to note out that there is another one called file output. If you're trying to get all your passes or different passes out because you want to maybe like go over this stuff in After Effects or Photoshop or something, this is a good node to have. You can put anything in here, and when you're rendering, it'll save that out. And it might not look like it can take more than one input, but if you go into your item, drop down the properties, you can add inputs, call them whatever you want. So we could call them like environment, bird, and fence, and then pop these in here, and they're going to save out to whatever path you set here. With the file name, whatever you set this to be underscore, and then the frame number, if you put an underscore there. I didn't do that this time because I didn't really need all this stuff. Again, this is kind of a throwaway project. I just kind of wanted the master output. Okay, so I think that pretty much is the end of this portion of the animation, and I don't think I have much more to say. If I do, I'll probably cover it in a later video going over other stuff.